You leave your window down and listen to the ice crack, because that means it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to move, supposed to crack. If it's not cracking, something's happening.
He was the king. Ice roads were ruled by him. The face of glory, grit, and danger on national television. However, in a single instant, everything Hugh Rowland constructed, including his body, his reputation and career, were crushed under too much weight, like thin ice. Though there was stillness among the fans. The producers did not respond. What about Hugh? He vanished. What actually became to the man who was referred to as the polar bear? Why was he removed by ice road truckers from past? And how could one crash reveal all the flaws in the riskiest reality TV program? It wasn't snow that caused the crash that altered everything. Black ice wasn't involved. It wasn't even the harsh path that Hugh Rowland had to endure in the Arctic for 30 years. It was a dry road. It was a clear day. There was no ice cracking beneath the tires, no storm. The tundra was devoid of wind yelling. It ought to have been among his year's safest drives. Rather, it turned into the most destructive. 2014 days ago, on August 3rd, Hugh was in a Dodge Ram as a passenger. He didn't trust Will Morrison, who sat next to him. Not only a co-worker but also a producer and lifelong buddy from the show that made Hugh a household name. They weren't pushing heavy loads over icy lakes in a race against the clock, or negotiating perilous cliffs. They were just coming back from a light-hearted excursion. The path ahead was steady and unchanging. Then everything changed in a few seconds. The truck veered. Hugh sensed it before he realized what was going on. Tires cried out. The steel twisted. The glass burst. The truck violently rolled off the road. It flipped repeatedly before ultimately resting against a tree, damaged and crushed. Hugh was scarcely alive inside that jumble of metal and broken stillness. He had not been dressed in a seatbelt. His arm was squeezed and pinched as his body smashed forward. His head broke. The windscreen. The rest was absorbed by his back. Instead of flashing, he woke up in a hospital bed. Cameras or worried manufacturers, but instead to the sting of a ventilator and the sound of machinery. The man who used to roar like a monster down icy roads was suddenly still. His back was hurt. Bones broke. He had trouble moving his arm. He was unable to even sit. The worst aspect was the silence, not the anguish. There were no calls from the show. No trips. No backing from the public. It was left to the man who had made ice road truckers famous to heal on his own. Betrayal, however, was more painful than the actual suffering. The truck driver on that particular day had not been a drunk or a careless stranger that night. Will Morrison had been the one. Additionally, in accordance with Morrison had been drinking, according to Hugh's subsequent evidence in court. Hugh claimed that he pleaded with him to stop. Pleaded with him to slow. However, nothing altered. The quiet began as soon as the crash occurred. Morrison never released a statement. He didn't ever visit the hospital. He disappeared, much like the assistants from Hugh's visage used to generate millions of dollars in advertising revenue for the network. Fans were unaware of what transpired for some time. The following season was broadcast as though Hugh had never existed. Not an homage. No justification. All that remains of the polar bear is a hole. Online discussion boards were ablaze with conjecture. Some assumed that he was retired. Others muttered regarding a wound. Some even believed he had passed away. However, the reality was more bizarre and sinister. More than most people thought. Ice road truckers had not been abandoned by Hugh. They had abandoned him. It was in December of that year that Hugh filed a lawsuit that rocked the business. He blamed History Channel and Original Productions, the show's production business, for failing to accept accountability. He charged Morrison with driving while intoxicated. Furthermore, he didn't halt at physical harm. He stated that the collision cost him everything, including his health, his name, his marriage, and his means of subsistence. Later, reporters were informed by his wife Diane that he wasn't the man she had married anymore. He had stopped laughing. His fire had gone out. Hugh did not consider the crash to be a tragic incident. It was erased. For a second, he was a well-known TV personality worldwide. He was shattered in a hospital bed the next day. Deserted by those who used his reputation to build their success. The case continued for more than 2 years. Liability was rejected by the producers. They said the mishap happened while they weren't on duty. Beyond their control. The industry silently observed behind the scenes, unsure whether to defend the brand or back the man. The matter was ultimately resolved in private. No, there was an apology. No sum was revealed. The tale vanished, buried beneath 1,000 different headlines. However, Hugh believed that no check could ever make up for what he had lost. His body gradually recovered. However, his reputation never bounced back. In the world he helped build, he turned into a ghost. There were rumors going around that the network had fired him because of the mishap. Hugh, according to one insider, was hard to control, fought orders, refused to put up a show for the cameras, and didn't want to act. Another said the crash provided the long-awaited escape for producers. Nobody made the statement in public. However, it was well known among people who worked in the background. Hugh was not let go. They erased him. Fans never received a genuine response. And a broken and betrayed Hugh decided to keep quiet. No appearances in the media. No interviews. Absence from social networking. The polar bear that had been unstoppable was now off the grid. However, the questions remain. Why did the network give him such a free pass? Why did nobody stood by him? And why did the friend who almost killed him leave him unpunished? Broken bones were not used to quantify the true extent of the collision's injury. Silence was used to quantify it. In lost trust. In an abruptly interrupted legacy. However, that was just the start. For the consequences would be far more agonizing than the catastrophe itself. What, then, ultimately caused Hugh to abandon everything he had created? And what was the secret he still wouldn't divulge? The fall from glory. There was more than just physical quiet following the crash. It was the type that becomes ingrained in your bones, the type that lasts longer than analgesics or hospitalizations. Hugh Rowland did more than just make it through the accident. He lived through forgetting. He was the face of the riskiest job on TV one day. He was a ghost the next day. The world he helped create was wiped out. No announcement from the network. No episode of homage. Not a reference in the credits, even. Nobody was supposed to inquire as to why the polar bear had vanished. It had never been as tidy behind the cameras as it appeared. Hugh had always been at odds with the producers. He was not suited for drama with a script. He was a tough, instinctive man. Not shot lists and storyboards. In the early Ice Road Truckers seasons, when the cameras first came in, Hugh handled them as he would any other piece of machinery. Disposable but useful. He wasn't there to take action. His purpose was to drive. And admirers discovered something genuine in that candor. Something that did not require a production team to be captivating. But the memory of television is fleeting. It flourishes on conformity, drama, and originality. Hugh had just gotten home from the hospital when he discovered he was disconnected. No phone calls. Not a single update. There was no indication that he will appear in the upcoming season. He made contact. Nobody answered. The pace was more painful than the stillness. The rate at which they went on. As though he had never been important. Prior to the collision, in interviews, Hugh had previously began to express worries. Producers are pushing for contrived tension, he said. He reported that he was instructed to fight more, shout more, and exaggerate his reactions. To create tension on screen. He fought back. He didn't want to appear sincere. He desired to display the actual risk. The actual labor. Not a hero movie adapted for television. And gradually, that opposition made him a liability instead of a celebrity. Around him, the team shifted. Former co-workers were swapped out for fresh faces. Those who were prepared to comply. In a rare interview, Hugh once stated, "My guys forgot we were drivers until the cameras arrived, and they began to believe they were performers. I realized then that something wasn't right." He attempted to retreat. He attempted to concentrate on your work. However, the road was no longer the focus of the presentation. It has to do with the ratings. Then there was the accident. The last blow. When Hugh filed a lawsuit against his old pal and the network, the silent split became a complete erase. Nobody desired to be connected with the dispute. Executives handled him like a legal danger behind the scenes. On location, it became prohibited to mention him. His former writers were instructed not to speak out. Some people left the show completely. Others choose to remain silent in order to safeguard their professions. Additionally, as the seasons changed, the man who, after being defined, the show's greatest enigma emerged. Fans were perplexed online. They overloaded discussion boards with inquiries. Where is Hugh? How did the polar bear fare? Why wasn't he given a farewell? Theories proliferate quickly. He had reportedly retired early. His age was blamed by others. Some urged he had departed due to health concerns. However, none of the tales were finished. Since the truth wasn't easy. It was a messy truth. It included betrayal, strained friendships, and legal threats so profound that Hugh would not discuss it for years. Even his relatives found it difficult to comprehend what came next. His wife, Diane, compared it to seeing a man fade away in slow motion. She claimed that he would watch old program footage in quiet for hours on end. Occasionally, he would chuckle. At other instances, he would simply switch it off and leave. His body was broken in the crash. But his identity was destroyed in the aftermath. He didn't miss the fame either. The respect was the reason. Toughness was the foundation of Hugh's existence. The man who never broke is around. However, something deeper was broken by the hush following the crash. He began writing in private. Not a memoir. It's not a news release. Only pages and pages of ideas. Years later, his family discovered them. Later, he wrote, they didn't take my life, in one. They simply removed the portion that gave it a feeling. He wrote in another, I gave them everything, and they left me, which made it worth living. In the absence of light. No phone call. Not a message. Simply disappeared. He never came back to Ice Road Truckers. Not even for a brief appearance. Not for the conclusion. He remained in Yellowknife, out of sight of the cameras. Away from his admirers and all that used to make him well known. He concentrated on the little things. Repairing vintage trucks. Teaching young drivers the basics. Speaking to children in northern communities about road safety. He no longer desired to be a celebrity. All he wanted was to be heard, even if it meant was only by a select few who understood the distinction between genuine risk and fictitious threat. The industry changed. His drivers were replaced by new ones. The focus of the show changed. The Polar the Bear brand disappeared from marketing, merchandising, and the official website. He seems to have never existed. The fans, however, never forgot. They persisted in their inquiries. They continued to search. They continued to wonder why the truth was never told to them. And Hugh continued to watch in spite of the quiet. In the year 2016, the lawsuit was secretly settled. There was no celebration. No news source broke the news. However, Hugh changed in some way. He gave up on finding a solution. He no longer anticipated an apology. Rather, he started to reconstruct. Not his notoriety. Not his picture. Only his life. Individually. By themselves. However, one question remained as the years went by. Stayed. Why did the network, the producers, and those closest to him leave so soon? Following the collision? What were they aware of that the general population was not? And why has Hugh mostly stayed? Even now, with everything behind him, silent? Might that be the true tale of Hugh's? There was always more to fall than a smash. Was there something more profound beneath the ice? A legend ignored. Hugh Rowland had no desire to become well known. Most folks didn't remember that section. Producers didn't hear his pitch. He had no dreams about magazine spreads, fan letters, or television cameras. His only desire was to drive. He centered his life on snow, steel, and engines. However, following the mishap, it became evident that no one else recalled that either. Following the lawsuit and the quiet. Although his name was removed from the program, his admirers' hearts remained intact. In a fan, his story persisted in trucking forums and communities. Like campfire, people exchanged theories. Rumors. Some thought he was on a blacklist. He had signed a gag order, according to others. However, none of them could provide an explanation. Why would the toughest guy on reality TV stop talking altogether? As is often the case, the truth was more human and far darker. Hugh's recuperation after the collision involved more than just his bones and joints. It concerned identity. The man who endured freezing temperatures and restless nights now required assistance to stand. He experienced agony when he raised his arm. His back would flare up if he sat for an extended period of time. In pain. Once routine tasks were now met with anger and frustration. It wasn't the wound that troubled him. It was the powerlessness. He had a reputation for perseverance. At this moment, he had to understand what life was like without it. Slowly, depression set in. Not the type that appears with tears, but they are the sort that gradually grind you down. Friends ceased phoning. The network had changed. The admirers were unsure of how to get in touch with him. The quietness increased in volume. His Diane, the wife, said it was like living with a ghost. Hugh continued to use the same hallways. He continued to sit at the identical table. However, he wasn't actually present. He attempted therapy but found it difficult to trust it. For a man who had been in a room all his life, fighting through agony, and it felt strange to talk about it. Nevertheless, he continued. Week after week. Seeking to comprehend how he was a man who could lose a lot of things quickly. His position in the world as well as his career. He resumed journaling in private. He filled notebook after notebook with recollections of the journey. The good times. The evenings when the sky was illuminated by the aurora borealis as he transported cargo over black ice. He described the morning diesel odor in his writing. The manner in which under his tires, ice creaked like a warning. And the fulfillment that comes from a successful delivery when everyone else said that it was impossible. However, those were only recollections. Additionally, in the present, the world had forgotten Hugh, and he had to confront it. He gave up watching TV. The sound of ice reruns of road truckers tightened his chest. He didn't miss the performance since the man on TV was no longer someone he recognized. The rough chuckle. The glare was harsh. The swagger. He was no longer that person. That individual lived prior to the accident. Prior to the treachery. His family published a little passage from one of his personal journals in the year 1999. It was a brief, nearly whisper-like sentence that was written without punctuation. I lost everything in the months that followed, not in the crash itself. One arrived. That single sentence conveyed more information than any interview could. Hugh hadn't been removed by pain, speed, or even ice. His absence had taken him out. The lack of concern. The lack of devotion. The lack of truth. At the same moment, murmurs began to reappear. A few asserted that the crash had presented an opportunity for producers. That they were sick of Hugh's refusal to play along while on camera. That they used his case as justification to eliminate ties and don't turn around. Hugh was too erratic, according to some. That he had produced challenges for the crew. However, none of those hypotheses clarified why nobody ever recognized once more. Not even a formal message. Not even a thank you in public. The mystery grew more complex. Then, in 2021, Hugh finally spoke up at a local podcast appearance. The voice had become quieter. Measured. Weathered. He made no accusations. He refrained from ranting. However, he made a glaringly obvious point. He hadn't vanished out of embarrassment. He had vanished because he was no longer accepted by the society to which he had belonged. The trucks remained there. The roads remained hazardous. However, everything had altered because of the cameras. He talked about the pressure to make a show. Producers' persistent pressure to make the show more amusing. More shouting. More stress. More predetermined peril. All I wanted to do was drive, I said. He acknowledged that the crash had been the last straw, saying, they wanted me to be someone I wasn't. However, the reality was that he had been losing ground long before that day. He was out of control. Of his picture. Of his intention. Of his narrative. After all this time, he still wouldn't give his name. Names. He did not directly blame Morrison. He made no specific accusations against the manufacturers. However, his message was unambiguous. Those who viewed him as a product had abandoned him, not a human being. Additionally, they tossed away the goods once it broke. Not all was lost, though. Hugh started helping injured truckers all around Canada in the years after his silent departure. He used his narrative to show others the true costs of the work, not to gain pity. He said in tiny events, spoke at technical schools, and established an environment where drivers could freely express themselves concerning injury, exhaustion, and the psychological costs of traveling. He was no longer the polar bear. However, he had discovered meaning, something as significant. One motorist who went to one of Hugh's presentations characterized him as a man who has endured a lot and continues to hold the door open for others. Hugh valued that quiet respect more than anything he had ever experienced while working on television. But there were still questions. Why didn't his name appear on the network again? Why did the people he spent years working with never publicly express their support? Was there pressure from the law? Was it embarrassment? Or was it just that there isn't room for broken legends on television? What else did Hugh never say? That is the most disturbing of all. The reality he withheld from camera in the years after the collision. Hugh Rowland didn't simply fade from the public eye. He turned into a legend. The individual who had previously used instinct and sheer willpower to drive through whiteouts, but was now a question mark. An apparition in the rearview mirror of a franchise he was involved in creating. The more profound admirers sought solutions, the more elusive the reality grew. And Hugh mostly allowed it to remain. In that manner, silence was his choice. Not because he was speechless, though. He opted for quiet because everything would alter after hearing what he had to say. Hugh had long attempted to safeguard the picture of his favorite job. He remained silent despite the lawsuit and the betrayal. He had a loyalty that didn't go away right away. He still had some regard for the roads, the craft, and the group of drivers who put their lives in danger while others sat comfortably behind screens. However, as the years went by and his body continued to recalcitrantly, that feeling of duty started to break. He began to sense that the stillness he had formerly considered to be strong was a falsehood. Then, in a rare interview for a British Columbian local radio show, Hugh eventually went farther than he had ever gone in the early months of 22. It wasn't broadcast on television. An audience was not present to wait impatiently. Only a peaceful studio, the voice of a man who has carried too much for two.